Howard here. I just wanted to take a moment on behalf of the Ontario Good Roads Association to welcome you. This is the latest in a webinar series that has been led by the Municipal Engineers Association, looking at the impacts of COVID on the municipal class environmental assessment process. For a number of years now, along with RCCAO, the Residential Civil and Construction Alliance of Ontario, the three organizations have been collaborating to impose some common sense reform to this process. We're optimistic that the conversation we'll be having here today will give some highlights about how municipalities can proceed with their regulatory obligations under the EA process, and at the same time give some insight about how to do so successfully, recognizing the dynamics of the pandemic. Again, we're fortunate to be joined by Dan Cozy, the Executive Director, as well as Paul Knowles, the impresario and guru of all things municipal class environmental assessment. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who will walk us through the rest of this. I'm going to recuse myself from this. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. And once again, thanks to the OGRA for allowing us to host the webinar on your platform. I think the MEA will be looking to proceed to get its own subscription to Zoom video webinars shortly. But good afternoon to everyone. My understanding is we had about 170 to 200 people sign up for this. Paul's going to start shortly. I just wanted to go over a couple of things before Paul starts. First, we're going to have, this is going to take roughly 90 minutes to get through the presentation, so we beg for your patience. There's a lot of things to go over. Secondly, we're going to have, instead of just a question period at the end, we're going to have a break after slide 48. We'll allot perhaps about 10 minutes for questions during the break. Then Paul will continue, and we'll move on to the end and then have another 10-minute question period. Questions, please submit your questions through the question feature here on Zoom webinar. If you don't know how to do that, there's also the chat feature. We'd prefer you'd put it on the question feature though. At the end, we are recording this, and we're going to post this webinar onto the MEA's website. And we will also post answers to all the questions asked today, including those we may not have time to get to. We'll have those on our website, hopefully within about a week. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Paul, our, as Scott said, our guru of everything MCEA related. Paul, the show is yours.
So welcome everybody. My name is Paul Knowles. Some of you may know I've been involved in the Class EA for a number of years here since almost the beginning. And there's a few things we've been working on lately, particularly an amendment to the document. But what we're going to focus on today is part of that amendment, but it's focusing particularly on the heritage bridges and the checklist that current one stated 2014. We're delivering a series of these webinars. We did one about the consultation during this pandemic a couple of weeks ago, April 23rd. There's the Heritage Bridge one today. We're looking at taking our usual course that we deliver in person and turning it into a webinar, possibly this fall. And then we're putting together, again, another webinar that'll talk about the amendments to the Class EA. The timing, of course, depends on when the government gets back into that and actually adopt amendments. So we'll see about doing it soon. So today, we're going to talk Class EA examination for bridge. We'll talk about that stuff first. Then we're going to go through the detailed heritage checklist and see how that all stacks up. Like, we'll walk through every question and look at some examples. And then we'll just talk really briefly about the Schedule A consultation process. A lot of bridges are going to become Schedule A projects, and yet I think, so it's worth talking a little bit about the process. So jumping right into it, we circulated a couple of emails to people in advance that talk about, one is a copy of the checklist. So this is the first page of the checklist. And the other deals with some sample example projects. So they're projects I just sort of made up to illustrate how you go through the checklist. So this first page, pretty straightforward, just something you should record: your project name, location, project engineer. Usually you're going to have an engineer. It's not mandatory, but this is just for the proponent to fill out. So the form is broken down into parts A, B, and C. Part A deals with that determination of the MCEA schedule, and it kind of just repeats what's in the Class EA, but I think kind of sums it up a little better. Part B1 talks about recognizing, is there something of heritage value that we already know about? It's already there, so you've got to figure that out. Then you see is there potential for value because of the setting, and then part B3 looks at the potential dependent upon the bridge. So you're actually looking at the details of the bridge in B3. And then part C, it really deals, it's not so much with the bridge, but excavation along a river. So screening for archaeological resources, that's also important. So if you're looking at the form, part A, the first question is this a repair or maintenance project to the bridge or grade separation? So we've defined maintenance, defined repairs. So just to explain, when you look at the form, you're going to see the black question and you're going to see the blue what you do depending upon the answer. The green is at the back. There's sort of appendix pages to the form, and I put them up here. But they're guidelines. Look to those green remarks as definitions or assistance of where you might get information. So repairs and maintenance are defined here. If your project's a repair and maintenance, if you answer yes, it's a Schedule A plus, or Schedule A, sorry, it's a Schedule A project. You should look at part C to see about your archaeological assessment if it's required. Even if you're doing maintenance, you might possibly be excavating, but you're done. You don't have to fill out you don't have to do any more of the form. And the corresponding line that's in the Class EA, this is the amended Class EA. We're changing the words a little bit. You can see in here it talks about bridges and expressways. They're not actually, the current Class EA is silent on that, so we've added those words with the amendment that we hope to be approved, but they've always been assumed to be in there anyway. So, and that's just a photo of some maintenance activities and repairs, just to make it fresh in your minds. So the next question is replace or rehabilitation of an existing bridge, grade separation, ferry dock that increases the vehicle capacity or is not in the same location, substantially the same location. Again, there's some definitions there. Vehicle capacity is defined. There's an interesting point here you want to notice is the vehicle capacity. What we've done is define capacity is the normal through lanes. So if you have a two-lane road, so you got to, there's certainly this exists in the rural setting. If you have a two-lane road with a one-lane bridge and you're proposing to increase, you're going to rehabilitate that structure and increase the size, the number of lanes to 2 to correspond with the two-way traffic, the two-lane road. That is currently a Schedule B activity. Under the current Class EA. What we're proposing, and this isn't part of the checklist, this is part of the amendment, so that doesn't come into effect until the amendment is approved, so just so we're clear on that, is that this would become an A plus project. So if you are changing the number of lanes, it's a Schedule B, but it's not counted, you won't be counting, going from 1 to 2 lanes would not count as increasing the number of lanes. So anyway, if you're increasing the vehicle capacity and you're not in the same location, you're into Schedule B. Doesn't really matter whether how you fill out the rest of the checklist, your Schedule B. And this corresponds to these clauses in the Class EA. Another thing to note, and again, this doesn't come into effect until the amendment is approved, but there is currently a reference to the hydraulic capacity of the bridge, and that is being removed, so it's only vehicle capacity. So that's the plan, is it would only be vehicle capacity. So only if you're taking a 2-lane bridge to a 4-lane bridge, for example, would that count as increasing the road capacity. And there's just a picture. So this is a kind of a significant change. 1-lane bridges to 2 lanes would be an A+, and that's a significant change. So keep that in mind. But it's not part of the checklist. It's embedded into this checklist, but it doesn't come into effect until the amendment of the Class EA is approved. So question 3 here, construction of a new bridge, underpass, or overflow for active transportation. Now this is a Schedule A+, if you answer yes. So instead of completing the checklist, there's some criteria that the ministry has developed. If you're building a new structure, you should follow, and there'll be links when this is finished and posted. There'll be links to get those documents. So it's an A+ project if it's for active transportation, recreational, or agricultural use. And this is the corresponding clause in the Class EA. Previously, this was a Schedule A. I think it was under 2.2 million, and Schedule B over 2.2, and we shifted everything into A+. Now we've shifted the new and the reconstruction separate for historical. So obviously, if it's a new bridge, there's nothing to consider historically. If it's an existing bridge, it may still be an A+, but you still go through consider the historical aspect of it. So you'd still go through the checklist we're going to get to. And there's just a picture of a nice active transportation bridge that's a Schedule A project, Schedule A+. So another one here, so if you're building a new vehicle bridge, grade separation ferry dock, and this is not active transportation. So if you're building a new one, you're into Schedule C. Now currently it's Schedule B or C depending on dollar value. And now the new ones with the new amendment would all be Schedule C. So again, for a new structure, instead of completing the checklist, there's these forms that the ministry has for evaluating the potential. So you want to click on those and go through those forms. And these are the corresponding clauses within the Class EA that talk about new water crossings, new grade separations, and they become all Schedule C. And there's just a picture of a new Schedule C project. Now, once you've gone through and you've decided that it is if it's a repair, if it's one of those above, you're kind of out of the process. And the process is for all of the others. So it's for those bridges that you're rehabilitating that aren't shifting, aren't getting increased in size. That's really what this checklist is for. So if it's none of the above, the schedule is going to be A+ or C. And this is a significant change. What we're going to do is walk through parts B and C of this checklist. And it's really part B that at the end of part B, you're going to end up that the project is going to be a Schedule A project, unless for some reason you can't agree with your technical cultural heritage studies. So what the purpose of part B that we're going to get to is to go through and either determine no technical cultural studies are required, and that's great. So none are required, you're Schedule A+. Or you're going to determine technical cultural studies are required, but you're going to do them, and then you're going to implement the recommendations that are contained in those studies, you're still A+. You're only Schedule C if you're not implementing what your technical studies tell you to, and that basically shouldn't happen. So that's the significant change from 2014, the checklist, when you went through and determined you had to do the technical studies. Well, it also said you had to do a Schedule B or C. Well, if you do the studies, so this is what the change is. If you do the studies and you're following the recommendations, it doesn't trigger. There's no need to do the Schedule B or C. You remain in A+. So you're going to want to figure that out early in the process so that you can follow Schedule A+. So I hope that's clear. Maybe it'll be clear as we work our way through. So these are the clauses again in the Class EA that talk about it's a Schedule A, the reference to hydraulic capacity is deleted, the issue about the one-lane bridges we already discussed. So these remain A+. But if you're building something new, it's a Schedule C. And this is another thing I'll mention. It's not really involved. It's not in the Heritage Bridge Checklist, but I thought this topic's about bridges and we should mention it. A new clause we're planning to add to the Class EA is if there's a disaster and you're responding to an emergency situation, and a bridge is not, this is an obvious picture, but it could be any municipal project. It could be something at your sewer plant. If you have a project that you're responding to an emergency, it is a Schedule A+ project, provided you notify the director, so the ministry director. So you'll see that hopefully soon if this amendment goes through. So it's not part of the checklist, that's part of the amendment, but I wanted to mention that to people while we were talking about this topic. So going forward, I kind of made up some projects here, 4 projects. So just to explain about each one, the first project is a bridge built in 1928. It's got steel girders, concrete deck. It was rehabilitated in 83. It's poor structural condition. The girders need to be replaced. The railing doesn't meet the crash tests. It's no good. But the substructure, the stone piers and abutment walls are in pretty good shape. They could be rehabilitated. And it's adjacent to an historic town hall. You can see the building in the background. So that's just a sample project. Another sample, again, it's steel girders, concrete deck. It's a pretty plain looking bridge. It was constructed in 82. It's a 1-lane bridge, but we want to widen it to 2 lanes and add a sidewalk. So it's got a 2-lane road running up to it, but now they want to increase the size of it and get 2 lanes across it. This one, let's just say it's a 5-meter box culvert, and that's something you think about a culvert being a bridge. Well, the definition actually is if it's over 3 meters, it becomes a bridge. So 5-meter box culvert installed in 1950, let's say, poor structural condition. This needs to be replaced. At the same time, you're going to maybe extend the length a bit and add some cycle lanes. Here's one constructed in, say, 61, a rigid frame. The deck, the substructure, everything's in poor condition, and you really think it's going to end up getting replaced and include a cycle lane. So those are the sample projects that we'll, when we start looking at the questions, we'll see how we would answer those, how they would fit. So diving into part B, and there's a little caution at the front. If you're not sure how to answer these, perhaps you might want to hire a qualified person, and I guess this is a qualified heritage expert if you feel that's necessary. I hope we've supplied enough information on here that for the most part, the proponent and the engineer should be able to answer these questions without engaging the qualified person. but it depends on your project and your setting. So is the proposed undertaking consistent with an approved conservation plan, if one exists? So if you're doing work, find out. So talk to the municipal heritage staff, the committee. Is there already an approved plan in the area? And is what you're going to do in compliance with it? Well, if there is a plan and you're doing something in compliance with the plan, then the answer is yes, and it is certainly, that's good. That's great. You don't need to do anything else in the checklist. Just carry on because you are complying with something that's already approved. If no, continue to question 2. So you can see how this works. You read the blue and you see whether you answer yes or no, and then follow that direction. So the next question, has the bridge or the study area be evaluated before and found not to have value? So the first one was, has it been evaluated and there is value and there's a plan? The next one is, we've already looked at this whole area and we know there's no value. And if the answer is yes, then carry on. Just, you don't really need to do much. And you're on to part C about screening for archaeological. The answer is no, continue to question 3. Is the bridge or a parcel of land in the study area? And that's important because it isn't just the bridge you're going to be impacting. Number 8, designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. So the green tells you where you can find that out, and there's a link there. Part B of that question, subject to an agreement or covenant or easement entered into under Part 2 or 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. So is it designated? Is it subject to an easement? For municipal easements, you contact the clerk. For provincial easements, there's the register, and there's links to get there. So you follow that advice. And if you're in the bridge department, you're probably going to have to talk to the local heritage people or the clerk to get these answers. But you should be able to come by these answers. Is a bridge or parcel of land in the study area included on a registry of inventory of heritage properties maintained by the municipality? So there's sometimes it's not designated, but it's on a registry. So again, same place, same source for this information. Is the bridge or a parcel of land in the study area subject to a notice of an intent to designate? So councils can announce an intent to designate. There's also a heritage conservation district study area. Is it on the ministry's list of provincial heritage properties? So again, there's a link to that. So that you need to look into and be able to answer these questions in the checklist. Is the bridge or a parcel of land in the study designated under the Heritage Railway Station Protection Act? So do you have an old railway station adjacent or nearby? Do you have a lighthouse nearby? The Lighthouse Protection Act. Is it identified as a federal heritage building or a national historic site or part of one? So again, you should be able to come up with answers to these questions, and you can see if one of these is true, you're probably going to need to, you can almost guess the answer. Is it a UNESCO World Heritage Site? Now, right now in Ontario, it's just the Rideau Canal and I'm not sure I can pronounce it, but there's only a couple of World Heritage Sites designated in Ontario. So you should know whether you're with one of those sites. So basically, if you answer yes to any of these things, you need to complete a heritage impact assessment, hire that the expert person, and proceed to Part C. But again, remember, you're a Schedule A+ project. You just have to implement the findings of what your consultant comes up with from a heritage point of view. So if you answer yes to 3I or J, you want to follow the direction of the management documents. But so now, if you've answered no to all of the above questions, then you move on to the next part. But any of those things would trigger you hiring the expert and preparing the plan. So on our sample projects, we look at the first project with the historic building adjacent, so you're no and no to the first two, but question 3A is yes. I mean, it's a designated building right adjacent to it. You're going to need to hire the heritage consultant. So go through your studies and then implement the recommendations of those studies and your Schedule A. But the other three projects, let's just say there's nothing in the vicinity. There was no answers to all of those questions in question 3. So so you're carrying on the checklist. The first project is really out now because you've already determined you need to go through the hiring the expert to do the studies. So on to B2, screening for potential cultural heritage value or interest. So will the proposed project involve a bridge that was constructed less than 40 years ago, which is currently 1980, so constructed after 1980, or constructed after 1956, and it's built with plain concrete substructure, and the superstructure construction is common steel or concrete products, and it's one of these 4 types: a rigid frame, precast with concrete deck, culvert or simple span, steel culverts or concrete decks, steel girders and concrete decks, sorry. So what we're talking about here is if it's less than 40 years ago, it isn't going to be heritage. It may have some community significance, but it isn't going to be a heritage issue. Part B, 4B here is if it was built after 1956, a lot of the structures built were pretty routine structures. And that's how we've defined them, is one of these 4 bridge types with nothing special about them. So you're going to see if you answer yes to either 4A or 4B, then you go to question 5, and it talks, so we'll jump down to 5. Will the project involve replacement of the bridge's substructure or any alteration to the adjacent lands? So the answer is no. So if you're going in and you're doing work on a bridge that's not a unique structure after 1956, or it was built after 1980, and you're not doing any work on the substructure, so the answer is no, then you're done the checklist. You would jump to part C. But if you're doing work on the substructure, then we need to continue. So here's just some examples of rigid frame structures. I'm sure many of you in the bridge business are well aware of this type of example. So just some pictures of typical rigid frame. Here's a precast with a concrete deck, one under construction, culvert or simple span. These are just some examples: steel girders, concrete deck. So these are all pretty standard, typical bridges. So just to repeat that question, so if you're less than 40 years or you're after 1956, so after 1980 or after 1956 and your common bridge type, then you jump to 5. If you're not, if it's something outside that, then you need to carry on to part B3. But if otherwise, it's you jump to part 5, find out if you're doing any substructure work. If you aren't, then just jump to C. If you are, then you're going to need to screen for the potential heritage value of the location, which is going to part B3. So looking at our heritage, our sample projects. Now, the first one, you notice I changed the font color on the answers here. We already decided that for the very question 3 in B1.3, there's a heritage building there, so we're already we've gone as far as we need to go on the checklist. We know we need to hire the consultants. But what if that project, basically exactly the same bridge, exactly the same project, but there was no heritage building there, no heritage town hall? What would that do? Well, if you answered, that would mean you'd answered no to everything earlier. What would you answer here? Would you answer no, no, and skip to B3? The next bridge would be answering yes, yes, and then no. So you're going to be skipping right to part C. The box culvert is no, no. You're going to skip to part B3. And based on the years, the rigid frame there is no, yes, and then you're going to continue. So I thought we'd take a short break there and just give you a chance to ask a few questions before we dive into the rest of it. So maybe I'll pause the screen sharing here for just a moment and see if there's any questions so far.
Thank you, Paul. So we're in about 35 minutes into the webinar so far, so I guess we're doing great for time. We do have a number of questions that have come in. One is a very general question I thought maybe I'd ask you right off the bat, and that's just someone asking, is there an approximate ETA for the proposed amendments to be approved by the ministry? Can you give us an update on that?
Sure. I wish I knew. When we talked to the ministry in February, they had said they planned to announce things in April. And so we were looking for our amendment to be posted. The next step in the process is to post it for comment. There'll be some kind of posting time. There'll be an opportunity for comments. Then we assume it goes to the minister for approval. So that was supposed to start in April, and then of course with the pandemic, that's all been on hold. And we assume it'll be high on the province's radar to when they actually feel they can move forward with things and not focus exclusively on the pandemic. But I really don't know when that's going to happen. So we hope sooner rather than later, but we'll see.
If I may add, Paul, I mean, we're hopeful that by the fall we'll have the amendments out. Now that's what we've got our fingers crossed for. But we don't know. Certainly, this pandemic has put things, behind the 8 ball, and I think next year also is an election year. So if we don't get an answer from the ministry by the end of this year, who knows what's going to happen if the government's going to move forward with the amendments during an election year. We simply don't know, but we're hopeful that by the fall we may have some resolution to this. Next question, Paul, is I'll read it verbatim. Can you confirm the statement that a culvert with a span greater than 3 meters is considered a bridge under the MEA? Or under the MCEA, I think is what he means. The definition of a culvert is an opening through soil which does not provide a span limitation, as culverts are considered differently in the example projects. This would provide overlap for structures that could be classified as bridges and culverts.
Actually, if you look at one of our clarifications from a number of years ago, there's it quotes, I'd have to go back and look, but it's a CSA code, I believe, that defines anything over 3 meters as being a bridge. And we've kind of gone with that definition. So yes, it's right in the definition part of it's in the document now, and it's right in the glossary of the definitions, I think. So yes, it's true. 3 meters is over 3 meters is considered a bridge.
Thank you, Paul. Here's a good one, Paul. I guess someone just wrote in a question regarding the fact that the amendments are still not in place. This person is saying he's assuming this would mean that current projects are to follow the current MCEA protocol until the amendments are in place. I think the answer to that question is yes. But what about the Heritage Bridge Checklist? Do those changes apply immediately, or are we waiting for those as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I should tackle trying to explain that. So yeah, the amendments, the stuff that relies on like those 1-lane bridges expanding to 2 lanes, that's part of an amendment to the Class EA, and we can't really change that until that amendment is approved. You may want to think about the timing of your project, and hopefully that happens, but no, that's definitely part of the Class EA. However, the checklist, what the current Class EA says is you have to satisfy the checklist, and if you do, your Schedule A, and if you don't, your Schedule C. So right now there's no, right now it says B or C depending on dollar value. So right now, that's something that's changed in the checklist. You can now satisfy the checklist. Let me start again. The current form, when you go through the checklist, you either determine it requires you to hire the consultant or it doesn't. And if you have to hire the consultant, it means you fail the checklist, you don't qualify, and hence you're in B or C. So what we've done is change the checklist that you don't fail the checklist by having to hire. You only fail if you don't implement what they say. So that's a change to the checklist, not to the Class EA. So I would say that the checklist, is you're fine. Like you could go ahead and use it now before the Class EA is amended. Now, just for the status of this checklist, I think we called it a draft when we sent this out, and it is. So the ministry, MEA had been working with the ministry. We had some input along the way. But basically, this is MEA and the ministry came up with this checklist. And I really wanted to have today's session with you people that are actually using it and have a little bit of an opportunity for you to have some input to see if there's something that isn't clear that should be tweaked. So I want to, after today, depending on the feedback, I hope we're pretty close and there's just maybe a couple of tweaks. But then we go back and say to the ministry, well, we've agreed basically on this, but I talked to some stakeholders and we think we should make this or these couple little tweaks. And by the way, now it's finalized and we'll put it on our website for use. And then you can go ahead and use it. So, so then it's still, as I said, there's a couple elements that you have to wait for the Class EA to be amended. But for the most part, you're going to be in Schedule A+ rather than Schedule B or C for these projects, for the Heritage Bridge projects.
Thank you, Paul. Let's try a couple more questions, then we'll move on with the webinar and then deal with more questions at the end. Again, a reminder to everyone, please submit your question through the question tab, not through the chat function. It's difficult for me to monitor both the chat function and the question function. Please submit your questions to the chat function. Also, there's upvoting. If you see a question on the question tab that you you may want to vote on it. That'll move it up to the top and we might be able to deal with it sooner than later. Just let me get to the next question here. If in an emergency situation, why would it be an A+ instead of an A? project, as it seems putting out public notice. Oh, I just lost the, sorry, I'm gonna just, somebody just voted on that question. I guess they moved it up. Sorry, so I'll read it again. In an emergency situation, why would an A-plus project, why would it be an A-plus instead of an A project, as it seems putting out public notice for an emergency issue seems unnecessary?
I guess, you know, the requirements for A-plus are not too onerous. It would seem still reasonable that if you got adjacent property owners, for example, and you're going to, you know, that example of the bridge has fallen down, it would seem that it should, no matter whether it's done as an emergency and, you know, done very quickly, at least talking to those adjacent people, letting them know what you're doing is, I still think that's kind of a reasonable expectation.
Okay, and the last question, Paul, part 1, number 2, states that it is a Schedule B if there is an increase in vehicle capacity and or a substantial change in bridge location. What would be the schedule for a bridge replacement with no additional vehicle capacity at approximately the same location?
So that's where you would answer no to that question. And then you would jump down, you'd be jumping down to number 5, you'd be none of the above. So then you'd be going through the checklist, seeing whether there's any heritage impact, et cetera, et cetera. But basically you're going to end up at A+. The only way you don't end up at A+ is if you determine that you need to involve the heritage experts, you involve them, and then you ignore them, and then you don't want to follow what they say. And then it turns into a C, so you can have purchase orders and everything else. So I just don't see that happen. It's going to be an A+ project.
Okay, Paul, and I'm going to add in one more question because this appears to be a very quick answer. In question 4B, by plain concrete, do you mean non-reinforced or plain simple in appearance?
Simple in appearance.
Okay. So that'll do it for the first wave of questions. Again, a reminder to everyone, all the questions will be noted. All the questions on the question tab will be noted and answered in writing and posted on our website in a few days, more than likely about the middle of next week. So if we can't get to some of the questions, right now we're at 22 questions and I think we've answered 5 or 6. If we don't have enough time at the end of this webinar, we will be posting answers, including those that have already been answered verbally. We'll post all those questions onto our website, so we'll be able to track those later on. Paul, the floor is back to you.
Okay, so I'll put the slideshow back up. Hope that's back up now. Okay.
Yeah, it's now back.
Great. Okay, so carrying on down the checklist. So now we're looking at the area around the bridge, and we're screening for, is there any potential for value? So one trigger would be, is the bridge or the project area described on a on-site municipal, provincial, or federal commemorative or interpretive plaque? So you've seen, everybody knows these plaques are, you know, common around bridges, well, common around Ontario. So is there a plaque? Does the project or the parcel in the study area adjacent to a burial site or a cemetery? And some green text there about how you can access information. Does it cross a Canadian heritage river? There's a link to where you can find out about Canadian heritage rivers. Is there local or indigenous knowledge or accessible documentation suggesting that the property or the project area is situated on a parcel of land that, one of these, is considered a landmark in the local community or contains any structures or sites that are important in defining the character of the area? And it gives you some examples here of, does the site or the parcel of land, does it have special association with the community, with a person or a historic event? You know, was there an indigenous sacred site, traditional use area? Was it a battlefield? Was it the birthplace of somebody? Does it contain or is part of a cultural heritage landscape? For example, an indigenous trail, a historic road, a rail network, rail corridor, park, designated garden. So is it one of these things? So for information, again, the green advice here, you could contact the elders of local indigenous communities, your Ontario, your municipal heritage committees, Ontario Historical Society. So there's some websites there, and then local people. So if you answer yes to one or more of these questions, there's potential for built heritage resources and or cultural heritage landscapes in the study area. So now you need to continue on to B3 and look at your actual bridge. But if you answered no to all of those things, then you can skip ahead to part C, and you're an A+ project. So in our sample projects, again, using the first one there without the town hall there, we would have skipped to part B3, we would have already done that. Our second project is already A+ and it's skipped to C. Our culvert that needs to be replaced, the 5-meter culvert, skips to B3. And the rigid frame, we answered no to everything there, and we skipped to part C. So that means there's only the 2 of our samples that we're even carrying forward to B3 now. So now we're into B3. So now we're going to look at the actual bridge and is there potential impacts because of the bridge itself. So 10A, will the proposed project leave the substructure of the bridge unchanged? So in the second part to that question, is the substructure of the bridge constructed with plain concrete with no untypical elements? And this is the appearance of it. Yeah, the structural, you know, what it's made up of in terms of rebar and what it's made up with internally is important as just the look of it. So if you can answer yes to A or B, then you can proceed. So if you've got a substructure that your project is not changing it. It might be repairing it, but it's not changing it. Or if the substructure, you are changing it, but it's only a plain concrete substructure, then you can answer yes to one of those and you proceed to discussion 11. Now, if you answer no to both of those, so you've got some substructure that's built out of stone, for example, and you're going to remove it and replace it and not rehabilitate it, then your answer is no, and there's potential for cultural heritage impacts, and you need to hire the qualified person to undertake the studies. So on this one, we answered the first one, assuming there was no heritage building there, we'd answer yes to the first part and then no to 3B. So are you going to leave will the substructure remain unchanged? Remember, they were just going to repair the stone abutments. So yes and a no. And number 3, we're going to replace everything that is built out of concrete. So it's yes and yes, and we carry on. So that was the substructures. Now we're talking about the superstructure. Is the superstructure of the bridge constructed with common steel and or concrete products? And it's back to these 4 sort of standardized types of bridges. Is it one of these four types? The rigid frame, the precast, culverts or simple span, steel girder, concrete deck. If it's one of those, so, and then B, will the finished product replicate the existing superstructure? So if it's one of those, it's common construction, or if it's not common, but you're going to basically put it back that it looks the same. So you can answer yes to both A and B, then you continue to 12. If you can't answer yes to both of them, then there's potential and you need to hire the expert. So here on the first project, we're going to replace things with what's there. So it's yes and yes, and the box culvert, you're going to replace it with another box culvert. It's yes and yes. So I'm usually go to number 12. So is work proposed on the parapet walls or railings of the bridge? So that's a pretty easy yes. Yes or no answer. If yes, are the parapet walls, are they built with materials other than plain concrete or steel and any atypical items? So if you're yes to both, then we need to go ahead to question C. If you're no to one of those, so either you're not touching them or the things you're touching are very standardized and they're not of concern. So if you're yes on both, you have to go through to question 12. If you're no to one of those, there's low impact and you've completed. There's low potential for cultural heritage impacts and you can proceed to part C. And then this is a change that we had lots of discussion about. So if you get this far and you get to 12C, you're replacing the railings and the railings don't meet the crash. So is the purpose of the work being done on the parapet railings to upgrade them to meet current crash test standards? If you answer yes, then you can proceed as long as you're using a sympathetic design. So the issue we've seen in the past is you have this heritage consultant involved, and there's always this desire to save a railing. The railing doesn't meet the crash test, so safety always wins out, and you have to replace it. I mean, why go through that discussion every time on every bridge like that? There's not a reason to keep repeating that process over and over again. We already know the answer. If you're replacing it because you want to meet crash tests, then yes, you can replace it, but you're obligated to look at trying to come up with a sympathetic design. That's something that you and the bridge engineer can figure out yourselves. You don't need to hire a heritage consultant for that. You're welcome to if you feel it would be useful, but that's not necessary. So if you can answer this question, if the purpose that you're doing this work is to upgrade it, the answer is yes. You proceed with constructing the parapet walls and railings with a sympathetic design. There's some guidelines here. So this in our example projects in the number 1, where we said yes, yes, and yes. So we're going to take that bridge railing off and replace it with something that's sympathetic. And on project 3 there, the culvert, there was no railings, so it's no, and then you don't have to. There's no railings you're touching. So to develop a sympathetic design for railings, the proponent, you should first consider retaining the railings. The railing is tall enough for pedestrian safety. You could consider providing a new barrier wall between the road and the sidewalk if adequate space is available. But remember, there has to be space for snow clearing operations. I mean, it has to function. So if there isn't adequate space, which I think a lot of times there would not be, then you need to remove the railing and replace it with one that meets codes. But just try and come up with a look that has the same characteristics to it. You know, if it has vertical steel posts, maybe try and come up with a railing that also has vertical steel posts. But this is something that's pretty subjective, but you know, you should be conscious of making that decision during the design, that you come up with something that's satisfactory to you, something that you're satisfied with. So for questions 10, 11, and 12, if the checklist indicates you need to hire a qualified person, do this during the EA study and follow the recommendations, which may include completing a heritage impact assessment. If the structure or property is found to have heritage value or interest, then you might have to do the cultural heritage value impact. It may be impacted by the project. Both of these should be included in your EA documentation and inform the decision-making in the EA process. So this should be part of your process. So maybe to sum up a bit here with our sample projects. So our first project was a steel girder concrete deck, constructed first in 1928, rehabilitated 93. So it's going to get replaced. So we're proceeding as an A+. It's got an adjacent town hall. And we're going to be implementing the recommendations of the technical cultural heritage studies. And that's, now if we didn't have the heritage building beside it, we would have still ended up with proceed as a Schedule A+, and we would have been rehabilitating the superstructure to look the same and reconstructing, rehabilitating the superstructure, so protecting the stone piers and rehabilitating them, would have been reconstructing the superstructure with the same elements and putting up a sympathetic railing so that met the crash test. And what you'd want to do is in your public engagement that you'd be doing with A+, you'd want to highlight the findings of the Heritage Bridge Checklist during your public engagement. So that's kind of sample project 1A and 1B, depends on whether the heritage building is there or not. So on sample project 2, with the steel girders, concrete deck, it's pretty plain. Want to widen it to 2 lanes and add a sidewalk. Now this would be a Schedule B until the Class EA amendment is approved, remember, because it's currently a 1-lane bridge. So this is assuming that the Class EA amendment is approved. But what you'd want to do is do it as a Schedule A, and again, you'd highlight the findings of this checklist in the public engagement for the A+. The box culvert installed in 1950, poor condition. You're going to proceed as a Schedule A+, and you're going to highlight the findings of the checklist in the heritage public engagement. So, you know, simply whatever when you do that public engagement, you're going to let people know that you at least considered the heritage aspects of the project and found, you know, just the conclusion was that there was nothing to protect in this case. This rigid frame, again, you ended up as a Schedule A+, and you highlight the heritage checklist. So as you see, all the sample projects end up as A+, because that's really what everything ends up as. as I said, unless you get into some very unusual situation where you're not agreeing with the cultural heritage consultants that you've hired, which doesn't make a lot of sense, really. You need to work that out. So that gets us through part B and the heritage aspect of everything. So now we move on, because the checklist also covers the archaeological resources. So if you're not sure how to answer some of these questions, you may want to hire a licensed archaeologist. But again, they're relatively straightforward questions to get a yes or no answer to. So will the proposed project involve disturbance to the bed of a water body, including a creek or a river? And if the answer is yes, so if you're going to be in the water, then there's criteria for evaluating marine archaeological potential. So you need to look at that document, follow the link, and complete it, and complete the questionnaire and follow that advice. Will the proposed project involve disturbance to a bed of water body, including, oh, sorry, that's the same question. So here's the green advice that goes with this question. So you'll leave it to you to read. Has the archaeological assessment been prepared for this study that recommends no further concerns? So have you already done some work? If yes, then you don't need to go any further. You just follow the recommendations. If no, continue to question 3. Are there known archaeological sites within 300 meters of the proposed project? And you can email Archaeology Ontario to find out. They have a database that you can check with, and the municipality may have the information. So if you're within 300 meters, then yes, archaeological assessment is required. If no, continue to question 4. Will the proposed project decision or activity result in significant ground disturbance? And there's a definition here of significant ground disturbance. So it talks about above and below water through human activities that have a potential to affect cultural heritage resources, including but not limited to altering the existing grade land, compacting, excavating, removing topsoil, power spraying, dredging, placing or dumping fill, removing vegetation, allowing heavy vehicles, trenching, drainage ditch construction, trail construction, scarification, soil mechanics studies. Now, ground disturbance does not include normal, regular farming practices such as plowing or tilling or gardening. So those are not part of it. So you're going to disturb anything. If the answer is yes, continue to 5. If no, then archaeological assessment is not required. So you got to look at what work are you proposing. Have all of the areas impacted by ground disturbing activities been subjected to recent, extensive, and intensive disturbances to depths greater than the depths of the proposed activities? So in this case, recent means since 1960, extensive means all over or most of the area, and intensive means through thorough or complete disturbance. So what this is really getting at is if you're going in and if the bridge was constructed in 1962, and you're going to go back in, and during construction they would have excavated and poured an abutment wall, and you're going to go back in here 60 years later and tear that out and replace it. Well, it's already been excavated down to rock, down to a foundation. So you could answer yes to this question. But if you're widening the bridge and you need to excavate further beyond what was excavated, or hasn't been excavated in the last since 1960, then your answer is no, and you're going to need an archaeological study. So it depends on your project and the extent of the excavation. Many of there'll be a lot of projects where you'll be able to answer yes to that question, that it's already been disturbed, so you won't, and therefore there's no risk of there being archaeological resources there. So that takes us through the checklist. So we're running in good time here. I just thought I'd spend a minute on consultation plans. And the Municipal Class CA, Section 8.3.5, talks about developing a consultation plan, how you need to identify stakeholders, means of contact, level of consultation, and the general timing of contact. And this, we're doing some amendments to the section, but fundamentally it's not changing it. It's just expanding of, with a little updated information, but basically it's the same. This has been the same for years. This is the expectation for MCEA projects. And everybody knows this nice flow chart that's in the book that talks about the yellow boxes are the mandatory public input stages. So what you want to do is sit down and you got to figure out who your stakeholders are for every project, and then how are you going to contact them. So you could have adjacent owners, tenants. That's probably on pretty much any project. And how's the best way to reach them? Could be letters, could be flyers. Users of the project. If you're doing some work on a bridge, people that actually drive over the bridge don't necessarily live nearby or even right in the community. So a sign might be a great way to notify the users of the project. The general community, you want to reach them through ads, press releases, websites, social media, special interest groups. You probably have to personally contact them. Governments and agencies, email's probably the best. The indigenous peoples, letters, email, personal contact. So you want to vary the means of contact with the various stakeholders. So now the Class EA, of course, lays out Schedule B and C projects, the expectations pretty carefully. Schedule A plus, it's very general. It just says you're obligated to notify. But what we're, I guess, telling people, and this is a section that got expanded in the when it's amended, is that in 8.2.1.1, is that your level of complexity should equal your level of consultation. If you've got a complex project, you should be putting an appropriate amount of consultation into that project. So then to repeat, you want to work on a consultation plan that actually, where you sit down and think about who are your stakeholders, how are you going to contact them, what's the level of consultation, and the general timing, like when is it you're going to contact them. So again, if this heritage bridge, and say it's right downtown on the main street, you got a heritage bridge. Well, you're going to have general community is going to be an obvious stakeholder, the adjacent owners, VIA, the Chamber of Commerce, could be cycling clubs are interested in cycle lanes going over the bridge, accessibility committee, beautification committee downtown. So you want to identify those stakeholders and then look at an appropriate means of contact for each one of them. And then what would be appropriate level of consultation and when? Well, let's, this project, this could be a pretty substantial project. You might want to have an open house in September, review the existing conditions, identify priorities. And most downtown projects, there's always a trade-off between Can you accommodate parking, cycling, or streetscaping? Because likely there isn't enough space in the road allowance to accommodate all of them that everybody wants. Then you might come back with another open house in November. We'll review the options for reconstruction. Over the winter, have individual meetings with key stakeholders, and then have a third open house in the spring and March where we recommend an approved plan and present that to council in April. So remember, this is a Schedule A+ project, but it looks very much like the consultation for a Schedule C, and that's fine. In fact, I think that's expected for a project of this magnitude. So although you can follow through the process, and the project that might have been a Schedule C is going to end up being a Schedule A+. The consultation isn't, I don't think, really going to be any different, or very little difference between the Schedule C process and the Schedule A+ process in that particular instance. Now, of course, because it's Schedule A+, you don't need the same level of documentation. There's no Part 2 order request. So there are several advantages to being in the Schedule A+ process. But this is where you really need to use your professional judgment and knowledge of the community to determine the appropriate level of consultation to go with the complexity of the project. So I guess I've sped through all of the checklist and a little bit about consultation, and we've got lots of time for some more questions.
Thank you, Paul. We've got a bunch of questions. A couple, just a note to everyone out there, a couple of questions I've answered myself, I've written the answer directly to the question because they were quite simple. But let's get on to some additional questions here. Paul, the majority of plain concrete culvert replacements would have been constructed prior to 1956. Are we expected to screen for CHVI?
If it's over 3 meters, then I guess yes, it's considered a bridge. And now your screening should be fairly simple to do. I think we've set up those questions that, unless there's something in the vicinity, some Aboriginal trail, or, unless there's something in the vicinity, I think you're going to have a, fairly easy time going down that checklist and just check the boxes, and then you'll just be carrying on as a Schedule A+.
Here's a question that I think I can answer, but I'll let you. I mean, I think the answer is yes. The question is, has the Heritage Bridge Checklist been cleared by the ministry to satisfy their requirements?
Well, yes, that's why, as maybe just repeat the status. So the ministry and MEA basically came to an agreement on this draft, and then we wanted to show it to you people, the users today, to see if there was, I'd hate to just finalize and here it is, go use it, and then people start pointing out the odd little flaw in it. So if you have anything that you think we can address or fix, please let us know right away so that we can do that and then post the final version. I'm anticipating, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be essentially what we just covered.
So, Paul, because there has been a number of re-asks here from people with regards to the earlier question about, can we use the Heritage Bridge Checklist now? I think what you're saying, to be more clear, is to say it can be, it's currently a draft. We're waiting for any last minute comments, in particular, participants from today's webinar, so that we can finalize it, resubmit it to the ministry, and basically get the green light to say it's good, and then it can be used even though the amendments haven't been approved. Correct, Paul, or not?
Yeah, basically, yes. And I anticipate that, like, within a week or 10 days, having it on the website of here it is.
Okay, next question. Does the A+ designation for emergency work apply only to repairs, stabilization, or can it apply to replacement as well once temporary stability work is done?
Yeah, it can apply to anything. Yeah, it's just generally worded. Any work you want to do that's responding to a disaster. You have an earthquake and your wastewater plant disappears. You want to build a new one. Schedule A+.
Okay, next question from my good friend Sadur Rahman from the city of Toronto. Sadur and I used to work together at the town of Oakville a few years ago. As per UNESCO heritage structures, sorry, I just lost the question. Sorry, Sadur, I'll be right there. As per UNESCO heritage structures to be preserved and repaired to look the same as is, if we have to rehabilitate a heritage bridge, then where will we find the specs?
That's something outside of the Class EA process. That's something I don't have any knowledge on.
Okay, fair enough. Can the answers to the heritage questions be answered by heritage planners at the municipality, or does it have to be an external consultant? That's a good question.
No, the checklist can be filled out internally by a municipal employee. They don't need to be an external consultant. They don't even need to have a particular heritage background. It could be the bridge engineer working with the local clerk's knowledge of stuff. It could be the combination of those two sitting down and doing it in a rural setting.
Okay, next question. Installing a new barrier between vehicle lanes and sidewalks can become a safety hazard in itself, depending on the location. Please consider softening the guidance to consider adding a barrier in this location as an approach to be considered and evaluated for safety and suitability on a site-by-site basis. I guess that's not a question, Paul, but that's a comment to you, and we'll certainly look into that.
Yeah, I'll read that again, but I think we do have it fairly soft in there. It says, it does say things like consider if it can be accommodated and meet safety. I think there's enough flexibility in there that it is pretty soft, but we can look at those words.
Okay, well, could you clarify why the town hall in sample project 1 does not impact the schedule selected?
Okay, I guess what I was trying to illustrate was it does. So remember the sample answers. It right at the first. I think question 3A. Question 3A, you answered it's a heritage building, and therefore jump to the end. You're hiring consultants, and that's what you have to do. And I only carried forward to show in the different font if the town hall wasn't there, but you still have that same bridge, what would happen, and how you'd still go through the process and end up at. So if there was no town hall, if there was no adjacent historical building, you would end up still at Schedule A. You always end up Schedule A+, but you wouldn't have had to hire the outside experts.
Question here from Michelle, who's I know is on our Young Professionals Committee. Hi, Michelle. Paul, what do you do if you don't know the age of the bridge, or you don't have records or access to someone who may know? I like that. What do you do?
I guess you come up with the best estimate, and estimate conservatively. So yeah, just come up with the best estimate you can.
Okay, I would agree with that, Paul. Well, I guess the document makes reference to 1956 at several locations. Why 1956, Paul, if the bridge type is still a common one?
The thinking was, well, it was all around World War II, and there being, of course, very little activity during and shortly after World War II. in terms of building bridges. They really got going, and and I think we had talked about, say, 1950 as being when kind of those new technologies, the more, the based on larger pieces of equipment, mechanical equipment working. Anyway, to be more conservative, we ended up with 1956 as being the date the ministry agreed to.
We've got time for just a few more questions, so bear with us. A bridge previously went through the B process and was filed, but scope changes occurred during detailed design and could trigger a C. Following the new checklist, it would be A+. Would the best course be to issue an addendum stating the rationale for it going to A+, plus adequate consultation, e.g. an open house?
I guess without knowing all the details, I suspected it might be the best approach is, instead of going through an addendum, filing it, 30 days notice, you might want to go, you'd have to have it, but do your consultation and say, this is now our project. It's now an A+ project. Part of the A+ is that notification that we talked about. Part of that notification should include the explanation of how you use this checklist and the results you came up with. So yeah, I think that might be the easier way to go about it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is a rather long one, so bear with me as I read through it all. The question starts, this is not a heritage bridge question, but a general EA question related to a bridge. If a 2-lane concrete bridge is in poor condition and needs replacement now, but an EA has been completed as part of the flood protection study that recommends increasing the span of the bridge, but implementation is still 8 to 10 years away. If the bridge is replaced now with a steel structure as a temporary measure, up until, I guess, that 8 to 10 year period, until the future structure is built, and converted into an active transportation facility, is an EA study necessary to construct the temporary bridge? And what schedule? Well, there's a demanding question. Paul, what do you think?
Well, there's nothing in the process that talks about exemptions for temporary projects. So, so I'd have to, I guess if you're putting like a temporary Bailey Bridge in place and during construction just to detour things, that, if you're building a new bridge, or there's nothing about, temporary being 10 years. There's nothing in our EA document that talks about exemptions for temporary things. So I think you can leave out temporary, and you just have to analyze and go down the checklist of, okay, you're going to replace this bridge with something with a bigger span. Well, that's fine. As soon as the amendment goes through, like right now, if you're changing the hydraulic capacity, it's a scheduled B or C. But when the amendment to the Class EA goes through, that won't be it'll still be an A+. So I would think it's likely just going to be an A+ project.
Okay, just a note to everyone. General questions like this might be better asked directly. If you go to our website, there's an Ask an Expert option. Generally, if you're looking for advice on an EA, you're not sure as to how to proceed, Paul is available to answer that question. You just ask your question. We generally can get an answer to you within about a week. So if you ever have a general question about the EA process, don't be afraid to ask us. We can answer those questions outside of the whole webinar process. Time for just a couple more questions, Paul. Should the proponent have detailed comments from the approval agencies and address those comments before issuing the notice of completion? Or is it okay to issue the notice of completion without comments from government agencies? We have a difference of opinion in our office. Some of us think that it is best to use the expertise of the agencies prior to the completion notice so there are no surprises. And others say we will issue a Class EA addendum if necessary. What do you think, Paul?
Well, I guess that's going to depend on the project, the timetable, like how urgent are you, what kind of rush are you in to get through the process, which commenting agency is it, and what do you expect anything from them that would significantly change anything? It would be a shame to, if you got some significant ministry that you're pretty sure are going to come back with comments that might result in a fairly major change. I think I'd be holding off and hassling them for their response. So I think you got to play that one by ear, depending on use your judgment. Depends on what the deadline is, what the potential impacts of the ministry's comments are.
I found two. I think these are short answers, so I'll ask these two questions, and that'll be it for today. Then we'll have some closing remarks. Could you please clarify how maintenance repair is distinguished from change in question 10?
Well, maintenance repair, just flip back to the slides. Maintenance and repair is really just extending the life of the current process, either replacing something, or your maintenance and repair is really extending the life. Maintenance means extends the life of the structure or keeps the structure safe for intended use. And repair is it fixes or replaces components of the structure to return the structure to its original condition. I think in number 10, then it was question 10, was it?
Yes.
So in question 10, I think, will the proposed project leave the substructure of the bridge unchanged? I think that's a little broader that's a whole rehabilitation, but is it going to look the same when you're finished? I think that captures a little broader range of more extensive work than simply a repair. Rehabilitation is a total repair, I guess. So a little broader scope of work.
Okay, and the last question, and just a reminder to everyone, we will be posting written answers to all the questions asked today, including the ones that Paul's answered already, onto our website. We'll be posting a recording of the webinar, as well as as the slide deck. Likely this will happen sometime next week. We'll strive to get it done as soon as possible, but we just need a bit of time to get some of the answers written. So last question, Paul. How do you define level of complexity in terms of consultation?
Well, again, this is your professional judgment. You need to look at the, what is the project and what is the setting of the project. I mean, working on a bridge in the downtown of a small town where you're going to be shutting down traffic and there aren't a lot of detour options, frankly, it's not the bridge work so much that's complex, it's the traffic and detours and shutting down road systems that's pretty, significant and complex. Whereas you take the same project and you move it to a different setting where there's either parallel bridges very close by, or you're out in the country on a low volume road and the detour isn't too bad, then that's not so complex. So it's those impacts to the community that I think you'd weigh as being complex, and the more complex, the more you want to engage the community.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think that's it. Do you have any final comments you'd like to say, Paul?
No, I think that covers it. As I said, we'll look through these questions. There's a couple we'll go back and look at the wording of to see if there's anything we should tweak. But it seems to me we're very, very close with this checklist, and we'll probably have it up on the website as a final document very shortly.
Okay, again, I'd like to thank the OGRA for allowing us to use their Zoom webinar platform. Appreciate it. Thank you, Scott.